So you're reading for us from Hell's Bell. What do we need to know before we jump into the scene?
So while I was writing this book, my glasses kept breaking and it made its way into the story. And so my hero she is the ultimate Bluestocking. And my hero is one of the biggest man whores I've ever written. So they're driving out to a house party. He had to climb in the carriage because it started raining. And they've arrived at the estate and everybody's climbing out of the carriage. And so that's where this scene is going to start at.
Awesome.
Okay. As the doorway cleared, he gestured to Miss Goodnight to precede him. Her brown eyes flew wide open, as though she'd not expected gallantry. Even with the blasted spectacles, he noticed her eyes now. She rose, crouched over, and edged sideways to make her way past him. Just as she did so, the carriage jostled, and with nothing to grasp to regain her balance, she tumbled onto his lap, dropping her bag onto the floor. My apologies, my lord, her breath fanned against his throat as she gasped her regrets. Despite all her bristle and intellectual outrage, she was still a woman. Marcus couldn't possibly ignore this fact with her squirming around on his lap. Soft bum, tiny waist, he'd not considered before what she hid beneath her petticoats and drab dresses. For one outrageous second, he imagined what her thighs would feel like wrapped around his waist. The tender skin between a lady's legs never failed to arouse him. When she pulled back to peer up at him, Marcus had to blink himself back to reality. Except one of her eyes looked perfectly normal, but the other was hugely magnified behind the remaining lens. The glass had fallen out again. A little freakish, to be sure, but she also appeared adorably confused and more than a little lost. Marcus couldn't help but laugh. Her face scrunched into a scowl, drawing even more hilarity from him. Lord Blakely, I'm glad you find my handicap so amusing. She turned her attention to his shirt front, lowering her face closer to it, and her curious hands began searching his person. It must be here somewhere. It took him another moment to realize she wasn't so suddenly overcome with his masculine assets so much as to fondle him, but that she was searching frantically for her lens. Tiny fingers explored down his sternum, past the waist of his breeches. Good God, did the woman not know what she was doing? She dropped to the floor and now kneeled before him, her fingers probing still. His thighs, around his lap, the seat. Hold still, woman, he finally ground out, and then crunch. Oh no, she froze. Apparently she'd forgotten all manners, all sense of social boundaries, as one of her hands rested on his no longer, well, uninterested. It's moving. Ah, yes. Marcus wasn't sure whether he ought to cover his face in mortification or turn the chit over his knees for a good spanking. Your mentula. My what? It's Latin, she mumbled, but hadn't yet withdrawn her hand. In fact, she appeared somewhat mesmerized, as though she'd like to investigate further. A swim in a frozen lake, vomit, an unemptied chamber pot. It took all of Marcus's imagination in order to conjure images so that he could bring himself under control. You, his voice came out, sounding strained nonetheless. You crushed your lens. Have a care not to cut yourself. Gripping her elbow, he lifted her ever so carefully from the floor. That dazed look on her face finally twisted into horror. Marcus ignored it. Instead, he bent over and retrieved what was left of the lens, all 7 pieces of it. I'm afraid you'll have to locate that other pair, Miss Goodnight. This one's quite beyond repair. She'd begun scrambling around, collecting the books that had spilled from her bag. Mostly romantic drivel, he saw, except for hell's bells. Did her mother know the extent of this hoyden's reading? The memoirs of a woman of pleasure? He could not quite make out the author before she hastily stuffed it into the worn but sturdy bag. Can you see to walk with only one lens? She seemed disoriented, but he wasn't sure if it was from her unanticipated examination of his mentula or her impaired vision. I'm fine, quite fine. She refused to look in his direction, choosing instead to feel around the door in order to climb out. When she did so, the sunlight reflected off the remaining lens in her spectacles and nearly blinded him. The sensation reminded him of when one of the boys at Eton had used a magnifying glass to torture insects. Marcus blinked and then, afraid she'd tumble to the pavement below, grasped her by the waist until he was certain she'd exited safely.